Hi, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by one of my colleagues, Associate Editor Jessica Mesman. Jess, thanks for joining us today. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you.
Well, for those who haven't seen it, Jess recently wrote a really amazing essay for the magazine. It's in our October issue. The piece is called Horror Movie Mom. It's part of the cover package. It's one of our many articles in the October issue about faith and horror and how they relate. And so we're just going to talk a little bit more about Jess's piece and Jess's story. Um, Jess, you talk a lot in this piece about your love of horror movies, and you talk about the ways that specifically people with trauma in their background, people with PTSD, that research has even shown that a lot of people gain a real therapeutic benefit from watching horror films. And I would just wonder if you could like tell us a little bit more about that from either your own experience or the research that you've seen.
Yeah, sure. So there have been some studies, some peer-reviewed studies that show that people who suffer from PTSD do often receive a therapeutic benefit, a measurable benefit from watching horror. And if people want to learn more about this, I would point them to the work of a scholar named Megan Podraza. I think that's how I pronounce her name. It's Podraza. She wrote a paper that was published in the journal Horror Studies, I think a couple of years ago, um, where she draws on that research. And she also is interested in the trope of the final girl, which I talk about um, in the essay, and the idea that horror movies can give us a way of processing, specifically as women, what it looks like to survive trauma. So the final girl trope is one you're familiar with if you've watched horror. There's usually one girl who survives and she's the heroine, but we never see what happens to her after the movies are over. And I find that idea so compelling, and Megan's paper on that is really great. So I would point people to that if they're interested in learning more after reading what I've written here.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, this piece, which is really vulnerable, and so thank you not only for writing this, but also for being willing to talk about this stuff here on the YouTube channel. You say in the piece that during the time of your mother's illness, religion became its own horror. And that's kind of, as I mentioned, one of the themes of our October issue in the magazine is the overlap between the horror genre and Christian practice and faith. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what that experience was like for you, for horror and religion to kind of become fused a little bit in your life.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was always there growing up in southeastern Louisiana and New Orleans Catholic culture. You know, New Orleans, pretty famously Gothic, and Catholicism really overlapping with folk religion and voodoo in real ways. So they were all kind of mixed up for me from an early age. And also, as I write in the essay, my mom was into horror movies. So I was watching a lot of them probably too young. So, and seeing The Exorcist is really a rite of passage for a Catholic child, I think, but there's really no way to get away from the um, overlaying of that with what you're experiencing in church and in school and Catholic school every day. Um, so as a child, it was firmly in place, but then things became a little bit, I mean, for me, that was kind of a magical time. It wasn't traumatic for me to watch those movies. I want to be really clear. Those were lovely moments I shared with my mother, and it was the kind of being scared that was still fun. But when she got sick and they started going to evangelical churches in search of faith healing, which wasn't really a thing in the church we were going to, or that I'd been raised in, that's when things got really scary in a way that wasn't fun. So when I say in the essay that my life kind of started to feel like a real life horror movie, first of all, there's the body horror of um, watching your parent morph into something you don't recognize from illness and treat the horrors of treatment, but also of being kind of subsumed into what to me, even then as a 13-year-old, felt cult like. Suddenly, and these religious practices were really foreign to me as a Catholic child. Um, the idea of like the cell group that would come to your house every night or a certain number of times a week and pray and throw Bible quotes at each other and like lay hands on people. All of that because of the horror that I'd already watched, things like Rosemary's Baby, felt eerily familiar to me in that way. And I definitely made that connection in my head between those movies and the stuff that I was seeing happen in my own home. Um, and it felt very invasive to me. What we were going through felt like it should have been more private. And I understand that they were desperate. My mom had a really rare form of cancer. She seemed perfectly healthy. She had a little cough, and she went to the doctor to try to figure out what it was. And she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer and given 6 months to live. So within 6 months, our whole world had fallen apart and blown up. So they were desperate and they were looking for any way to survive this. And that unfortunately made them really vulnerable to these kinds of communities that tend to, in my experience, prey on vulnerable people. And so all of it, yeah, seemed really predatory and disturbing to me. And there's one scene from my childhood that I really distinctly remember, which is when my mom was actively dying in the hospital, that the room was just full of these strangers praying over her instead of letting us have these last moments with her. And it seemed really terrifying. My mom did not die peacefully. Um, it was not an easy death. It was not a good death. It was a traumatic death. She fought until the bitter end. So to have that scene happening with people, praying in tongues and around her in a circle, preventing us from getting to her, that to me felt like its own horror movie. So processing those events in relationship with my own, my own trauma therapy and grief therapy as an adult. I wasn't given any of those things as a child because you didn't do that in the evangelical church. You just prayed. And because I wasn't processing my grief very well, that was also seen as a failure of faith. And there was a very strong suspicion that, because I hadn't believed properly, I might have caused the miracle that everyone was claiming to be obstructed. So there was so much guilt and horror on top of the grief. So does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. And thank you for sharing that. Well, the piece does end on a little bit, I think, of a lighter note. And so we will follow the footsteps of this article and end on a lighter note as well. You mentioned at the end of the article how your kids view you as they Joyce from Stranger Things reminds your kids of you, and you also like that association. You said, I love Stranger Things, and I wondered if there's a favorite moment of Joyce on the show that really speaks to you, or is there a moment in your life where you are a lot like Joyce? Anything you want to share about Joyce from Stranger
Yeah,
Things?
I'm not going to lie. As a Gen X woman, I was delighted to be compared to Winona Ryder in any way, shape, or form. But I do strongly identify with Joyce Byers. I think it was flattering to me that they made that connection, not just because she's awesome and Winona Ryder's awesome, but because Joyce so clearly is the parent who is close to her children and they trust her and they love her and she knows them really, really well. And there's a scene where spoiler alert, it's been a while. If you're going to watch Stranger Things, you might want to turn it off now. But when they discovered that Will's body really is a fake, when they find his corpse in the quarry, and she knows it's not him, and everyone thinks she's just a hysterical mother, but she's right. And she knows, she's so confident when she looks at it, she's like, I don't know what that thing is, but it's not my son. And I just love how her involvement in their lives. I mean, she's clearly depicted as like the working class parent who's doing everything she can to keep it together. She's a single mom. They don't have an extravagant or well-appointed home, but it is a place that you can tell that they are well loved and well known and well protected and cared for. And so the invasion of this horrible thing that comes into it is even more distressing. So that's
Wow.
a lot of why I identify with her.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that if someone hasn't watched season one of Stranger Things by now, it's probably not high on their to-do list.
Yeah.
Um, so final question. For those who don't have our physical magazine, in the October issue, in the letters and comments section, there's a cool little recommendation list of horror films to watch from you. I was excited that that was in our magazine. You also mentioned a lot of horror films in this article, but some of them only very briefly. I just wondered if there's any other character or movie that you just wanted to give a shout out to, or that you feel a special connection to before we sign off here.
Well, I think I covered my top three in the article that I really have strong emotional connections to, which are Diane Freeling in Poltergeist, Joyce in Stranger Things, and but I didn't go so much into Danny in Midsommar, who I also really love. And the reason I love her is, I mean, the movie opens with a horrible tragedy. She's completely traumatized. She's trying so hard to be in this relationship with a man who is dismissive and kind of awful. And she goes into this, she goes to this remote Swedish village with some other graduate students and immerses herself in this culture. And she's a little resistant at first, and she's still trying really hard to perform like the good girlfriend and not upset anybody and not get in the way. And she has this really liberating moment. Well, she has several throughout the film, and really the climax of the film is a really twisted, liberating moment for her. But there is a moment I reference in the article where she participates in what seems to be some kind of grief ritual, and she just allows herself to have this really physical experience of letting her grief out of her body and dropping of that mask of trying to be sane and together and perfect and okay for everybody, and that grief like just coming out of her in a rage is a really beautiful scene to behold. And there's another mom in the Babadook who has a similar tortured experience where you see her grief, or at least that's how I interpret it, leaving her body. So those are two moms that, I mean, those are disturbing moments in both films. They're not funny and cute as Joyce Byers often is, but they're interesting to me to see portrayals of women dropping that mask of perfection or trying to appease or people please and just letting their grief come to the fore.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. Anyone out there who has not read the article, there will be a link below in the video description where you can read Horror Movie Mom. And also, if I can find it, we'll put a link below for the research that you mentioned. Jess, thank you so much for chatting today about horror films.
Thank you for having me.